So the New Testament is, of course, one of our best sources, not just for the Jesus movement and early Christianity, but also for ancient Judaism and to understand the world in which ancient Jews lived. In the New Testament, we find, how one first century Jewish thinker like Paul and his Gentile followers understood the world, right? Their attitude to the Roman Empire. So to do great research in Jewish studies, we need all the tools that scholars of the New Testament have developed. And more than that, right, to understand the language of the New Testament, right, ancient Greek, you need the linguistic, literary, art historical, archaeological, right, all the tools of classical studies research as well. So top scholars of religion are equipped with the tools of biblical studies and classical studies. They're conversant, right, with early Judaism and Christianity. But it turns out that's not enough, because if you really want to know more than the history of just elite men, you also have to be attuned to intersectional analysis and the power dynamics of antiquity, especially in society that marginalized enslaved people of all genders. So I preface with all of this because no one in the field of religion has demonstrated this level of interdisciplinary research and ethical commitments over the entire length of their career, quite like Bernadette Brooten. In the early 1970s, Brooten's article on Junia the Apostle pointed out what ancient Christians had known, but more recent ones had forgotten, that women served as apostles and leaders in the early Jesus movement. Generations of scholars had missed this because androcentric assumptions had prevented them from reading the evidence that was right there in Paul's letters. Brooten's research on women's leadership in the ancient synagogue in the 1980s also highlighted the inscriptional evidence for women holding titles, right, of leaders in synagogues all over the Mediterranean world. Previous scholars had assumed that such titles were functional for men, but merely honorific for women. And Professor Brooten pointed out the sexist assumptions that undergirded those essays, opening up a pathway for much more accurate and inclusive history. In the 1990s, long before it was considered best practice, Brooten was placing the writings of the Apostle Paul in conversation with astrological texts, magical texts, medical texts, dream interpretation texts, as well as Greco-Roman literary works. I'm referring, of course, to her 1996 book, Love Between Women, Early Christian Responses to Female Homoeroticism. She was striving to find already then, right, what ordinary people were doing and saying, even as she analyzed how elite authors tried to direct their behavior. So I submitted my proofs for my own book just this week on angels and ancient Jewish culture. And I kept thinking about how the book that I wrote would not have been possible without the path-breaking work of Professor Brooten. So Bernadette Brooten is the Kraft Hyatt Professor of Christian Studies, of Women's and Gender Studies, of Classical Studies, and of Religious Studies at Brandeis University. She is the founder and director of the Brandeis Feminist Sexual Ethics Project. This project aims to create Jewish, Christian, and Muslim sexual ethics rooted in freedom, mutuality, meaningful consent, responsibility, the pleasure of each participant, untainted by slave-holding values. The title of her talk today is Outside the Frame: Enslaved Persons in New Testament Ethics.
Thank you so much. And thank you, especially thank you to Mika Ahuvia for that lovely introduction and for your work. I really look forward to reading your forthcoming book that will show the diversity within ancient Judaism, that Judaism is a religion of law, but not only a religion of law, that there are other modes of interacting with the divine, including through the understanding of angels. So that really is path-breaking, and I'm very excited about it. So I would like to launch right into my talk. In the last century and a half in the US, formerly enslaved persons and their descendants have sometimes seen parallels between the cross and the lynching tree, to use the name of James Cone's 2011 book. Perhaps the veneration of a man tortured and crucified particularly spoke to those persons in the Roman Empire most often tortured and at risk of crucifixion if they rose up against their masters and mistresses. One of the very earliest texts within the New Testament, a hymn in Philippians, Paul's letter to the Philippians 2, verses 6 to 11, represents Christ as taking the form of an enslaved person and then being lifted up by God. So going down to the great level of an enslaved person and being lifted up by God. A theology that may well have inspired enslaved persons in the Roman Empire. Whatever their theologies might have been, enslaved persons appear in the earliest communities of Christ believers. Today, I will analyze several ethical dilemmas faced by enslaved persons if they tried to follow certain ethical exhortations. The life circumstances of the enslaved, as imagined based on ancient literary, documentary, and material evidence, will help to illustrate how enslaved individuals did not fit within the frame of ethical teachings. The contemporary theory of intersectionality will assist in viewing persons living in bondage as whole, complex human beings, negotiating inequalities and obligations based on discriminating among categories of persons. The theory of slavery as institutionalized sexual harassment will make visible hindrances faced particularly by enslaved girls, boys, and women toward living out sexual values so central to some New Testament texts. Finally, I will draw upon historical research on US slavery, not for its research results, but as an inspiration to ask new questions of sources from the Roman world. I will first summarize Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, which she created in 1989 to reconceptualize US law so as to enable persons who experience discrimination on more than one axis, such as race and gender, to bring successful anti-discrimination lawsuits. Several cases demonstrated to Crenshaw that Black women were disadvantaged when they could not sue an employer under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 for both sex and race discrimination. In DeGraff and Reed v. General Motors, 1976, 5 Black women alleged that General Motors had discriminated against them as Black women by not hiring Black women until 1964, and then by firing all of the Black women hired after 1970 in a subsequent recession, that is based on seniority, in which they were disadvantaged from the start. The federal district court granted summary judgment for General Motors, stating that the lawsuit had to state a cause of action for race discrimination, sex discrimination, but not a combination of both. Thus, these Black women lost their case because the court would not see them as Black women, but rather only as Black or only as women. Crenshaw argued that the court did not understand the complexity of Black women's lives and that a new concept was necessary. As a concept, intersectionality has traveled, developed, and been critiqued. Jennifer Nash in Black Feminism Reimagined After Intersectionality, 2019, argues that a singular focus on Crenshaw's concept obscures the rich intellectual contributions of other Black female intellectuals, both in the past and in the present. I address Nash's critique by including other Black women scholars in my analysis to draw upon the richness of that tradition. Now, in this lecture, I'm using intersectionality in a way that comes as close to its original Title VII meaning as possible. That, however, places significant limitations on intersectionality's usefulness for the ancient Roman world, which had neither a civil rights statute nor even the concept of illegal discrimination on the basis of sex or any other category. Quite the contrary, the politically powerful in the Roman world, as well as religious leaders within Judaism and Christianity, based their teachings and their laws on the foundation of individuals and groups knowing their place in the world, with respective obligations, duties, and in some cases, rights. An enslaved person might bring suit on the grounds of having been wrongfully enslaved, but they could not file a discrimination suit for legal enslavement or for harsh treatment as an enslaved person. Ancient Mediterranean persons with power, most frequently freeborn men, believed in discriminating among individuals and groups, in discerning difference and creating social and legal structures based on difference. Further, intersectional legal analysts today aim to create a just society free from discrimination. As a 21st century scholar and advocate, I cannot help an enslaved girl in antiquity. At root, however, an intersectional approach can enable a scholar today to see figures from the past as whole persons and to hear ancient texts as a range of early readers might have heard them. The US federal courts, even today, in the US federal courts, even today, persons suing on one ground, such as sex discrimination, are far more likely to win their cases than persons suing on multiple grounds, such as sex and race discrimination. In Crenshaw's terms, the courts and judiciaries are not viewing plaintiffs whose identities have put them multiply at risk as whole persons with more than one identity. Similarly, most scholars of the ancient world generally think along one axis. For example, within Judaism, when examining the rabbinic cluster of women, minors, and enslaved persons, Nashim, Katanim, Va'avadim, scholars tend to assume that the women are free, the minors are boys, and the enslaved persons are men. What if a woman is enslaved or a minor is both female and enslaved? Does one take the Jewish religious laws, halachot, that apply to females, those that apply to minors, and those that apply to enslaved persons and add them together? No. So our analysis of these categories needs to include the multiple identities that depart from the normative free adult Jewish man. In addition to intersectionality, the contemporary legal concept of slavery as institutionalized sexual harassment, developed by legal scholar Adrian Davis, is a helpful heuristic for slavery in the Roman world. Davis applied the contemporary civil rights category of sexual harassment to 19th century slavery. What is today illegal was fully legal within 19th century slavery, as well as in ancient Mediterranean forms of slavery. Even today, of course, few plaintiffs alleging sexual harassment, sexual assault, or rape actually prevail in their lawsuits, and juries rarely convict in cases of alleged sexual assault or rape. So we still can ask, are these phenomena fully illegal? But in the 19th century, they were not illegal even in the law, with a few exceptions. So the question arising from this use of a contemporary civil rights term for another period of history that did not recognize such harms is, does harm, such as the harm of rape, occur when rape is not illegal? In other words, may one legitimately apply a contemporary concept from civil rights law to a historical period in which that concept is foreign? I argue that rather than being anachronistic, this process can help a contemporary reader to historicize by understanding ancient concepts as thoroughly other. In addition to the legal theory of intersectionality and to the conceptualization of slavery as institutionalized sexual harassment, I'm drawing upon Stephanie E. Jones Rogers' They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, 2019, a remarkable book, as well as on other scholarship on slavery in the Americas. This research helps me to ask new questions of ancient sources while taking full account of historical differences between slavery in the antebellum period and in the Roman period. For example, Jones Rogers establishes, contrary to previous scholarly opinion, that white women actively engage in buying and selling human beings, including at public auctions. So I asked the question about the extent to which women in the Roman world engaged in such activity. Married white women in the antebellum South could not own property in their own names, and yet they fully engaged in buying and selling human beings. In the Roman world, married Roman female citizens could and did hold property, including human property. So their engaging in controlling, buying, and selling enslaved persons seems historically even more likely, perhaps to a greater extent than hitherto thought. Today, I will argue that enslaved persons fall outside of the frame of New Testament ethics because ethical exhortations would have created conflicts for them, or they may well not have been able to fulfill some of them at all. Exhortations along a single axis, such as to wives and husbands, or in universalistic terms, such as unmarried and widows, 1 Corinthians 7:8, obscure the multiply stratified societies in which these occur. Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality and Davis's of slavery as institutionalized sexual harassment, and Stephanie E. Jones Rogers and others' historical research on slaveholding and enslaved women will help me to delineate the ethical dilemmas faced by early Christian enslaved persons. So these are the frameworks with which I am working, but I will not explicitly be speaking of, I will not be using the terms intersectionality, but you can see that they are, let's see here, where am I? Okay, this is what happens. It worked before. To share the screen, I will try once again. There we go. Yes. So in the late 40s and into the 50s, the Apostle Paul wrote around 7 letters that virtually all critical scholars agree he himself wrote. In addition, the New Testament contains another 6 or 7 letters that many scholars believe fit into the common ancient practice of attributing to one person writings composed by students or later followers. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians is undisputed as a letter by Paul himself. In 1 Corinthians 7:8-9, Paul writes, and I'm using the New Revised Standard Version, NRSV, here and throughout, although at some points I alter it, which I will note. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is well for them to remain unmarried as I am. But if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. So I've included the Greek. I will refer to the Greek, but time does not allow me to read it. So could enslaved people remain unmarried or even marry at all? Were they free to practice self-control, that is, to abstain sexually? According to Roman law, which would have applied to Roman Corinth in the 1st century CE, Enslaved persons were not allowed to enter into the institution of matrimonium reserved for Roman citizens only, but could enter into an informal relationship called contubernium. Contubernium entailed no rights, privileges, or obligations. A child born into contubernium had no legal father, could not inherit, and was enslaved by virtue of having been born to an enslaved mother. Now, few, if any, of the readers of 1 Corinthians were Roman citizens, but instead followed their own marriage customs in which Roman authorities did not interfere. Nevertheless, I know of no reference to enslaved, legally married people in Corinth. We should instead imagine that their owners sought to control their fecundity and intimate relationships, which raises questions for 2 verses later in 1 Corinthians 7, namely 25 to 26. Now, concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I give my opinion as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the impending crisis, it is well for you to remain as you are, that is, to remain a virgin. To the master or mistress, and again, we certainly know of mistresses in the Roman world. Enslaved children represented their future wealth, and they would greatly hesitate before countenancing celibacy on the part of their enslaved laborers. Paul's contemporary Columella, living near Rome, wrote in his agricultural manual that he incentivized enslaved women's giving birth, and I quote him, "For to a mother of 3 sons, exemption from work was granted. To a mother of more, her freedom as well," close quote. If slaveholders in the Roman East, so he's in Rome, but if slaveholders in the Roman East followed advice such as Columella's, enslaved female followers of Christ in Corinth could have faced a choice between a lessening of their heavy work burdens and even their freedom by following Paul's advice to abstain from sex. These and other verses in Paul inspired generations of later Christians to lead celibate lives temporarily or permanently. So that by late antiquity, numerous Christians viewed monasticism as the superior form of Christian life. Enslaved persons sometimes enabled their mistresses and masters to lead holy lives in monastic communities or in their own homes by serving them in an enslaved capacity. But that is quite different from being able to live monastic lives themselves. Enslaved persons were generally not allowed to enter monastic communities without the permission of their owner, because the owner thereby relinquished that person's labor and reproductive capacities. Some enslaved persons resisted their enslavement, however, by fleeing to monastic communities, a few of which granted them safe harbor. Likely a student of Paul wrote the epistle to the Colossians, which differs from the advice in 1 Corinthians to remain celibate and not to remarry upon the death of one's spouse. In Colossians, the household does not consist of virgins in long-term celibacy or married partners refraining from sex for a time, as in 1 Corinthians. Instead, Colossians presents the ideal of a prosperous household led by a slaveholding husband and father with a subordinate wife and obedient children and enslaved workers. Colossians 3:18 to 4:1 is the oldest known household code. So verses 18 and 19, wives, be subject, hypotasista, put yourself under, be ordered under, to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord, curious. So I'm going to come back to that. Husbands, love your wives and never treat them harshly. So with respect to the word curious applied to the Lord, We will see this word used again throughout this passage. Here, the author theologizes wifely submission by presenting it as the Lord's will. In contrast to some later household codes in the New Testament, the subordinate party, in this case, the superordinate party, in this case, husbands, have an obligation placed upon them. Submission of free women to husbands was enshrined in law and regulated by society, whereas husbandly love and lack of harsh treatment were not. For example, legally, a free wife had to tolerate her husband sleeping with another woman, whether free or enslaved. A free husband, in turn, was not prohibited from beating his wife. If a free wife did not submit to her husband, law and society saw to it that she did. But if a free husband did not follow the Christian command to love and not to treat harshly, there were no legal and possibly no outside social consequences. Now, how might enslaved wives and husbands have heard these commands? As I just observed, their masters and mistresses may not even have recognized their relationship, and it did not have legal standing. The early rabbis, who were, however, far from the epistle to the Colossians geographically and culturally, allowed enslaved women and men to marry one another, but not free Israelites. More research, however, is needed to establish what exactly enslaved marriage entailed or may have entailed. Would an enslaved Hebrew man have been able to acquire an enslaved Hebrew wife, which is the term used for acquiring which is a category used for marrying a free wife, acquire, and require that she have sex with no man other than herself, which is what he was able to require. Or to use the rabbinic terms, was there kinyan? Were there kiddushin? Was a divorce document required upon dissolution of the marriage? If so, it surely could not have included, you are free to marry any man, as those deeds of divorce, agate, given to free women did, because an enslaved woman was in fact not free to marry any man. Was there a marriage settlement, in Hebrew, a ketubah? What about enslaved non-Jews belonging to Jewish owners? Were they allowed to marry? And if so, what did their marriages entail? So I would encourage people, maybe someone here on this Zoom call, to do research on that subject. It's very under-researched. But what we find is that in Christianity, religiously accepted enslaved marriage is not documented in early Christianity until long after the New Testament. Whatever recognition enslaved Christians might have had for their marriages, would they have been able to follow these commands? If an enslaved wife sought to submit to her husband, but the master or mistress prevented her from doing so, the master or mistress had the whip and other weapons at their disposal. An enslaved husband, in turn, may not have been able to love his wife as he wished. Colossians 3, verses 20 and 21. Children, obey your parents in everything, note here, for this is your acceptable duty in the Lord. Again, curious. Fathers, do not provoke your children, or they may lose heart. Legally, enslaved children were fatherless. They could not inherit from or take the status of their biological fathers. They had no legal father to protect them. And like enslaved wives, the command of the master or mistress would take precedence unless the enslaved parent or child found a way to resist. In the face of harsh realities, an enslaved biological father may have treated his children harshly, believing that doing so could help to prevent greater harm to them if they did not learn at a young age how to submit to the master or mistress. Now, Colossians 3:22-28 contains the most extensive commands in this household code. Enslaved persons, obey your earthly masters and mistresses. So I have taken the liberty of departing from the New Revised Standard Version and adding mistresses. The Greek word kurioi is grammatically masculine or grammatically common. In other words, in the Greek language, you can include under the word for siblings, adelphoi, both female, both brothers and sisters. And so similarly, kurioi would include the female and male persons who believed they owned another person. So obey your earthly masters and mistresses in everything. Again, note the everything. I will discuss that briefly. Not only while being watched and in order to please them, note here the surveillance, but wholeheartedly fearing the Lord, kurios. So now, as you may have noticed, I use enslaved person, enslaved laborer, enslaved worker, rather than slave, to stress the humanity of the individual, indicating that that person is much more than the state of bondage in which they find themselves. Translation is more complicated because this household code addresses enslaved Christians directly, assuming that they have moral agency. I am giving this text the benefit of the doubt. And so for that reason, instead of translating douloi as slaves, which is what the New Revised Standard Version and virtually all other versions do, I am translating it as enslaved persons. But that's up for discussion. And I translate masters and mistresses because, as I mentioned, they both can be female and male. Observe here the association of kurioi with kurios, the Lord. So while the intended enslaved reader, and I do mean reader, some enslaved people in the Roman world were literate and even read to their master or mistress as part of their work, or they were accountants, or they wrote contracts and so forth. A few, but some. So while the intended enslaved reader was to understand that the Lord supports slavery, an enslaved reader or hearer could well have instead preferred the theology of the Philippians hymn that I discussed earlier, in which God lifts up Christ out of slavery, or the story of the crucifixion and the resurrection. As I have outlined elsewhere in a publication, I learned from formerly enslaved Sudanese anti-slavery activist Menda Nazar that you don't obey your master because they tell you to in church. You obey your master because you're terrified. So that's a very important thing for anyone studying these texts to know. And Menda Nazar argues that people who study slavery should speak with people who have experienced slavery, even though there are many historical differences. Nevertheless, to open our eyes to enslaved persons' ways of thinking, even when the circumstances are somewhat different, but they also overlap in many ways. So this text likely did not have the function of persuading enslaved Christians to obey those who claim to own them. Could the text instead have functioned to communicate to enslaved Christians that this branch of Christianity would not support self-emancipation, that is fleeing, would not use church funds to redeem fellow believers from slavery, which some early Christians did, because the Lord supports a hierarchically well-ordered household? Could it also have signaled to the outside world that Christians did not intend to challenge social structures? The phrase "in everything" could have been heard differently by persons of differing genders. Master sexual domination over the enslaved, especially women, has occurred in most forms of slavery and could fall under "in everything." Obey your earthly masters and mistresses in everything. Seneca the Elder, 1st century BCE to 1st century CE, reports a saying about men: "Unchastity is a crime in the freeborn, a necessity for an enslaved man, and a duty for a freedman." The words "the more slave women, the more lasciviousness" are attributed to rabbinic sage Hillel. Early rabbis, that is Tanaim, in line with Roman law, that is Gaius Institutions 181, disallow a free man from marrying an enslaved woman with whom he is suspected of having had sex, including after he has freed her. So it was about having sex and not about being allowed to marry. Resulting children would be enslaved, which aligns with Roman law, rather than with Genesis, in which Ishmael and other sons of enslaved women are free. Ancient rabbis tend to punish or blame enslaved women for unions with free men. Now, the early church also recognizes that masters may rape their enslaved women, as Basil of Caesarea in the 4th century does, but no ancient canons or church orders place any penalty on a master for having done so. Earlier in the 3rd chapter of Colossians, verse 5 begins a series of ethical exhortations, and I quote, "Put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthly: fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry," close quote. Fornication, impurity, and passion are at the very head of this list. I am assuming that an enslaved girl wanted to live a Christian life in accordance with these ideals, that she appreciated the implication of her moral agency implied by this and the following exhortations. Yet how could such a girl have put to death fornication if she were forced by her master into sex, a subject that Colossians nowhere addresses? She could have resisted her master and could have been successful in her resistance, but she more likely would not have been able to fend him off permanently and would have lived a life of moral compromise, or worse, blamed herself. Alternatively, she may have wanted a sexual relationship out of affection or a desire to be freed by her unmarried master and married, or both. In this case, a longing for freedom would have conflicted with the ethical norms laid out in Colossians 3. So whatever your task, put yourselves into it as done for the Lord, curious, and not for your masters, or masters and mistresses, in this case, anthropoi, human beings. So the word curious is not used here. Since you know that from the Lord, curious, you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You serve the Lord Christ, curious Christos. So notice the point to the future reward. You will receive the inheritance as your reward in the future. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for whatever wrong has been done, and there is no partiality. Is the wrongdoer here the enslaved or the master or mistress? One can read it either way. Even if your master or mistress requires you, for example, to enter into a fraudulent contract on their behalf, do it as if for the Lord, because the owner will be paid back for the wrongdoing. or alternatively, perform every task well, lest you receive a future punishment. Colossians 4:1 addresses the superordinate party. Masters and mistresses, kurioi, treat your enslaved laborers justly. So this here in Greek is a noun, isotes, which I will come back to, and fairly, for you know that you also have a master kurios in heaven. So kurios and kurioi here signify something different, as the author places even the superordinate humans in a subordinate position to a kurios in heaven, whereby kurios here means both master and Lord. So the Lord himself is conceptualized as a slave master. How might an enslaved person have heard justly and fairly? Everyone knew that corporal punishment of enslaved laborers, children, and wives was legally and socially acceptable. And I do not know that anyone in Christian history has ever read justly and fairly to exclude such. Isotes, a noun here translated fairly, can also mean equality. The equality certainly does not mean absence of hierarchy. That would have been alien to nearly all of the Roman world. I take it here to mean treating another person as a fellow human being, not as a thing, although in Roman law, an enslaved person is both person and thing. Justly and fairly is nevertheless an admirable concept that may contain the seeds of future equality. The New Testament household codes reinscribe Christianized, theologized values of the Roman Empire. They were easy to disperse, that is, these ideas, because Christians read them in church, preached on them, taught them, and later wrote commentaries on them. The hierarchies of the Roman world existed before and outside of the household codes. Social, economic, and legal practices create these hierarchies. The practice of beating a wife, a child, or an enslaved person predates and exists outside of these household codes, but the household codes give theological legitimacy to the requirements to subordinate oneself and to obey. That is the Christian novum. The authors of these codes make them more appealing and effective to the commands to husbands to love their wives, not to be harsh with their children, and to treat their enslaved laborers justly and fairly. Strikingly missing from these latter commands to the superordinate party, are church policies and procedures for constraining husbands who do not love their wives, fathers who treat their children harshly, and slaveholders who cruelly humiliate their enslaved laborers. Compare this lack of procedure with Paul's recommendations in 1 Corinthians 5 on how to deal with the man who is having sex with his father's wife. And I quote now from Paul, "Should you not rather have mourned so that he who has done this would have been removed from among you?" So kind of excommunication. "When you are assembled and my spirit is present with the power of our Lord Jesus Christ, you are to hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord." So that's a little complicated. I can't get into the details of it, but it sets forth a way to take this man out of the community, and we do not have that in Colossians. And further, it does not define failure to love, overly harsh treatment of one's children, or just and fair treatment of one's enslaved workers. The weaker parties experience constraint through social practice and legal strictures, whereas the superordinate parties experience only exhortatory words, but no structures for church censure, and certainly not for societal censure or punishment. The weaker parties, however, could and did resist. Enslaved persons could perform their work slowly or shoddily, could resist sexual advances by their masters or mistresses, could take valuable objects from their owners, could kill their own enslaved children, could poison their owners, and could self-emancipate by fleeing from the household. Or they could try to obtain a better future for themselves by obeying and performing well in the hope of being freed. A woman or a girl could also try to enter into a sexual relationship with an unmarried master in the hope that he might free her and then marry her. Enslaved Christians hearing or reading the Colossians household code and the other comparable ones in the New Testament surely led complex moral lives formed by a desire to follow Christian ethical teachings and yet having to negotiate mightily on how to do that. Thank you for your attention.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bernadette. Let's see, I'll go back to some sort of gallery view here.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, so if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. I will moderate and hopefully we'll get to lots of your questions. Apologies in advance if we run out of time. I guess since I'm the moderator, I'll just kind of summarize what I heard in hopes that that helps people sort their thoughts. So what I hear you doing is really kind of modeling a way of listening and reading texts and asking questions, right? Like, how would this have been heard by an enslaved person? I also see that you're reading contemporary evidence. You're saying, yes, this is relevant. I know it's 2,000 years later, but we should be hearing from formerly enslaved people. And finally, you're noticing like ways not taken, right? Like Paul he did want to hold members of his community accountable. And yet the church kind of chooses not to hold free men within their community accountable for certain crimes, right? For certain transgressions. So I guess those are kind of three strategies I'm hearing. And I have to say, like, I really appreciate kind of these three methods that you're offering. One of the most profound learning experiences I've had in the last year was through talking to a friend of mine who specializes in genocide here at UW, Rowan Avrar, those of you that know her, in Law, Societies, and Justice. And she was talking to me about biblical texts, especially their emphasis on reproduction. And I was telling her, like, yeah, the Hebrew Bible, all the stories are just obsessed with women reproducing. And she said, when I talk to survivors of genocide, they're also very much focused on reproduction. So it was just like so interesting because suddenly I've been reading these stories of Genesis for so long, but I was like, of course, right? These are written down in the aftermath of catastrophe and near genocide. And suddenly I can see how women too, right? Not just men would have suddenly valued reproduction over their own freedom. And so I thought that was it was important to me and it made me want to read more contemporary stories. So I appreciate your modeling that as well. So, okay, we have a question from Amanda. So thank you for your translation of enslaved persons. What are your thoughts on translating kurioi as enslavers? Right, it loses the parallelism with hokurios, but it gains parallelism with the action performed.
Yes, I certainly think that's a good possibility. And yes, enslavers, I do. I think that people wouldn't know the connection among the various kurioi and the kurios in the text unless you put it in Greek in parentheses. So I think that that's an equally valid. I'm thinking what the valence is of enslaver versus master. Enslaver emphasizes or sometimes people say slavers. That's another term that can be used. Yeah, I think that you get something with each of the translations. So master ties in with mastering oneself. And so sometimes in ancient Christian thinking, for example, Tertullian, a second, third century Latin church writer in North Africa, his ethics are based on the model of a master controlling his enslaved laborers. And so too should a man control his own passions, control his own urges, and so forth. So with master, you get that aspect of the order. With enslaver, you get a greater emphasis on the person as claiming to own other human beings. So I like that. I will think about that and think about it as an alternate translation. Thank you for the question.
Awesome. Okay, we have a question from Robbie, which I really appreciate. He says, thank you, Dr. Brooten. Could you talk about Paul's letter to Philemon?
To Paul's letter to Philemon, yes. So Paul wrote a letter that in the New Testament takes up one page, and he is writing to a man who apparently has an enslaved laborer named Onesimus, which means useful. And sometimes in antiquity, enslaved names had particular meanings. So a person who is useful to the owner, or they could have sexual meanings also, which is horrific, but they could, like delight, for example. And Trufosa, one of which there is one in the New Testament in one of Paul's letters to Romans. So Philemon, now this is a very debated point. That's why I say apparently. So apparently this enslaved man has come to be with Paul, who is in prison. And he spent time with him, and he served him and helped him, but served him. And Paul sends him back to Onesimus with a highly diplomatically phrased letter saying, please take him back. If he stole anything, I will pay for it. Please treat him as a brother. And so this can be read in more than one way. Is he mainly sending an enslaved person back to their owner rather than giving the person refuge or helping the person to escape? Because if this man had left Philemon, he probably was fleeing some harshness or wanted to, whatever he did not want to be enslaved. And because in antiquity, slavery is not based on the way one looks, people could escape and not necessarily be under suspicion if they got to another city. So we do have flight. Is he alternatively expecting Philemon to manumit him, to free him? And he's simply phrasing it in the most diplomatic way that he can so as to achieve the goal that Onesimus will become free. Now, the question has been raised by Alan Callahan, a New Testament scholar, whether he actually was enslaved at all. So this is a very disputed topic, and he claims that that was not considered to be the interpretation until the 4th century by John Chrysostom, a 4th century Christian writer who wrote in Greek in Antioch. And then he also was in Constantinople. That, however, is not really an argument because I don't know when there were earlier discussions of Philemon. In other words, it wasn't a widely discussed letter. It's a short letter. It wasn't widely discussed. So I'm not sure that earlier silence on the point indicates that people thought he was not enslaved. And I don't know, and he doesn't cite any earlier sources for his not being enslaved. So he simply says that in the 4th century, he was. And he does point out that it doesn't outright say he was enslaved. He says to accept him back as more than enslaved, as a brother. So that's the question. I have to say that in my opinion, Paul put Onesimus at risk by sending him back. I think that Paul genuinely hoped that he would manumit him, or in any case treat him better. But there was a reason, and I do believe that he was enslaved. There's a reason that he left Philemon, and I assume that to be a good reason. So he's at risk. Yeah, those are some of my thoughts on Philemon. Thank you for the question.
Yeah. So others, you are welcome to submit more questions in the Q&A. I actually wanted to ask you just briefly, I've never heard anyone talk about how common slavery was in the Byzantine era. And I think that's why it's always been very difficult for me to conceptualize the continuity of enslavement from the Roman era to the modern era. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. Well, starting a little earlier, Kyle Harper, writing on late antiquity from mainly the 3rd and 4th and into the early 5th centuries, slavery in late antiquity, Kyle Harper, Kyle Harper, has done a very good study of that time period and finds that slavery did not recede. So this is the period starting, of course, in the 4th century with Constantine, when Christianity becomes a licit religion, and then eventually the state religion, but in the beginning it's tolerated. And so Christians had nothing to fear from the Roman emperors. And so one line of argumentation within Christianity has been that Christians really wanted to abolish slavery, but they couldn't because they couldn't challenge every social structure of society, or they would have been persecuted out of existence. But then that raises the question, why didn't they then abolish slavery when they had the opportunity to, when they controlled the Roman Empire? And they in fact didn't, and we have evidence of massive enslavement also in late antiquity. And then this goes into the Byzantine period, and in the Greek East and in the Latin West, it goes into the Middle Ages. And so what happens in the Latin West is that slavery begins to coexist with serfdom. So when, for example, 12th century canon lawyer, inventor of Catholic canon law, really, by bringing all of the earlier canons of church synods and councils together and trying to unify them, he speaks of servus or serva, and we don't know whether that means enslaved person or serf, because both exist in this period. They are unfree persons. So people in medieval studies often use the term unfree to refer to different types of unfreedom. And in the Byzantine Empire, one good resource on that is Yuval Rotman, an Israeli historian who writes on slavery in the Byzantine world. And again, it continues to exist and doesn't really go out of existence. And actually slavery in Europe doesn't go, and slavery in Europe also doesn't, slavery in Europe doesn't go out of existence either.
Yeah, I mean, Rashi in the medieval period is a Jewish legal thinker, right? He's commenting on how you should treat enslaved women. And when I first encountered that, I was like, really? Even Jewish, people were still engaged in slavery in the medieval period. And indeed they were, all religious communities were still engaged.
Very interesting. Where does that occur in Rashi? Do you know that? Is it in his commentary? Is it in the biblical commentary?
That's a great question. I studied it at yeshiva, and it's one of it was so traumatizing for me because I was like, this is so ahistorical. But anyway, then I realized it was historical. So I can get that back to you, but it's from my yeshiva days many years ago.
I never have time. I'm very interested in that. Thank you.
Yeah. So I do want to welcome other questions. We have a follow-up question about kurios. You can see this question, right? So to what degree does the Septuagint tradition of translating the Tetragrammatonus Kurios inform usage in the New Testament? And he asks if there are pre-Christian Jewish views of God as Kurios that are behind the scenes here. But by the way, in late antique Jewish poetry, Jews are also using Kurios for Lord. So they're being shared by Jews and Christians at the same time.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. That's just what I would say is that there is a whole tradition there. Exactly.
So
Yeah.
we have a question from our graduate student, from Jennifer Hunter.
Okay.
So she says, although nearly 3 centuries after Paul was writing, there is an interesting reference to the wife of a slave in the Stele of Theodorus, dating to 320 CE. Post-legalization of Christianity by Constantine, who lists his scenes on the stele. One of the sins is that Theodorus had sex with the slave of Haplocomas. Wow. So does this statement strike you as unusual for the time period?
Very interesting. Well, I'm very interested in that. And if it's part of your dissertation, I don't know, but if you could send me the precise reference, I will mention you in whatever I write about this. So I do not take graduate students' work and give it under my own name. I would mention Jennifer, but that is a somewhat, I would say, well, that's a particular situation, namely sleeping with the enslaved woman or boy belonging or girl belonging to another person. That is an offense under Roman law that is actionable, that can be the basis of a lawsuit. So sleeping with somebody else's enslaved person, that is a crime, infraction against that person. So therefore, that person can sue you for damages because you have diminished their property, their human property. Yeah, so that's very interesting to hear that they put that, and whether now that's whether the I need to see the whole context also, whether the point is that the person slept with an enslaved woman and that's a transgression, or whether that they slept with an enslaved woman belonging to somebody else. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. These texts are really hard, so I really just want to thank the audience for staying with us in these, discussions of really difficult times. So I want to thank everybody again for joining us. And thank you for Professor Brooten. We want to invite you to join us next week as well for Dr. Brendan Goldman's lecture. And I think he's actually here in the audience too. He's a specialist in the Cairo-Geniza. And let's see, we'll have a slide about him momentarily. There we go. He'll be speaking about minorities and state violence, the view from the Jews of the medieval Cairo-Geniza. And you can also ask Brendan about how slavery, the evidence for it, continues to show up in our text from the Cairo-Geniza. So maybe, Professor Brooten, you can come back for Brendan on this topic too.
Yeah, lovely. And would you mind just mentioning the Feminist Sexual Ethics Project?
Oh, of course. Yeah, let's ask Rosa to share the link to that again in our text. Yeah, so again, Professor Brooten is the founder and director of the Brandeis Feminist Sexual Ethics Project. And yes, I need to keep up with the work there too. We also want to invite you to save the date for our Stroum lecture this year by Professor Julia Watts-Belster. She'll be talking about reading Jewish texts in the age of climate change. It's going to be a really wonderful lecture series.